have
Go
the
ahead.
opportunity to talk with you again so soon. But I have to tell you, I'm a bit afraid because now you've had a lot of time to think about what I said last time and to refute all of my points. So this could be tougher this time around.
Well, I wouldn't have invited you on if my objective was to refute all your points. And so maybe that's but there are definitely issues that I think play through. And you and I actually had a conversation beforehand, where I highlighted for you, like, I hate some of the language that you're using to describe this stuff. Um, but let's start. So very quickly, you have a book, and this is your third book, I believe. It's called The Paper Money Revolution, or the Monetary Revolution. And the idea is very straightforward, that something changed when we moved away from the gold standard. It was a recognition of a world that is very different than the one that is presented to us in our history books, and that opens up a path of possibilities. Now, those who regularly listen to me are familiar with my expression on the term MMT, and I just want to clarify that you are not explicitly saying this is MMT, nor are you aligning yourself with that school. But fundamentally, that's a reasonable way of thinking about the dynamics that you're identifying. That elements of MMT, as I describe it, are true, but they don't tell you how you should spend the money. Does that feel fair?
Yes, that feels fair. If I can just add that I've been developing these
Please.
ideas for a decade, long before I heard of MMT. So yes, the book is called The Money Revolution, and the subtitle is called How to Finance the Next American Century.
And so the part of the reason I was drawn to that is it hits on a number of points. And just to be very clear with people, well, we started a few minutes late. I'm going to try to be very respectful of everybody's time. We're going to try to keep this firmly to an hour. A replay of it will be available on my Substack. I'll also try to put a transcript. We're going to get super fancy on this. And Richard has a presentation, some of the slides of which I'm going to share throughout this. But I'm going to try to be really disciplined about, organizing this and trying to get it through in just about an hour. Now, Richard, I love the fact that you're clarifying that, you did not derive this after hearing about MMT. And, I was very similar. I developed my ideas independently. There's video out there of me appearing at a speech with Warren Mosler that Warren Mosler was part of in 2012, in which I expressed the sentiment that I have continued to express, which is the ideas behind MMT are quote unquote true, but they don't tell you what to do. Now, what you've done in the Money Revolution and what you do in your general business, and I just want to make sure that I identify for people that you offer a subscription-based service and newsletter that is really kind of the way that you pay the bills and frees you to have the time to think and write things like the Money Revolution. Could you comment on that just very quickly?
Yes, thank you very much for introducing that, Michael. My video newsletter is called Macro Watch. And every couple of weeks, I upload a new video of me discussing some important new development in the global economy and how that's likely to impact asset prices, stocks, bonds, commodities, currencies. Usually these are 15 to 20 minutes long. They usually contain 30 to 50 charts that people can download. And so I hope your listeners will check that out. They can find it on my website, which is richardduncaneconomics.com. That's richardduncaneconomics.com. And if they would like to subscribe to Macro Watch, hit the subscribe button. And if I'd like to offer a 50% subscription discount. If you use the discount coupon code January, you can get a 50% discount off the subscription price for a year. So please check that out, or at least sign up for my free blog while you are there.
Fantastic. All right. So let's get into this now, because the way you start the book, and I think this is actually really important, is the way I basically ended up going through this as well, is you begin with a history of the Federal Reserve, identifying where it came from, what it was used for, and how quickly that changed versus the initial impetus to it. I'm going to try to put up the chart into the nest. So I just hope everybody can be patient with me as we do this, but maybe you can start with a quick description of why the Federal Reserve was created and what evidence you have about how that began to change things starting back in 1913, 1914.
Right. So the book has three parts, and the part one is a history of the Fed, and I think part one by itself is really worthwhile because it tells the history of the Fed in a very unique and very precise way. I don't believe that this has been done before. It traces the history of the Fed by showing the evolution of the Fed's balance sheet, how its assets and liabilities changed from the time it was created it began operating in 1914 up until last year when the book was published. And tracing changes on the liability side of the Fed's balance sheet show exactly how the Fed created money. And when you trace the evolution of the Fed's assets, it shows you exactly what the Fed did with the money that it created. And so this is a very clear way of telling the history of the Fed. So anyone who's interested in the Fed, and everyone should be, because the Fed is the world's most powerful economic institution, should read The Money Revolution because it explains it very clearly there.
So I just shared into the nest the first of the slides that hits on this, and I'm also going to put up the table of contents. And then I want to very quickly move on to the chart that effectively shows that change in balance sheet. So let me, I'm actually going to skip that. I'm going to go straight to the chart, and I want people to be able to see how quickly the Fed's assets changed. I just want to make sure everybody is oriented as to the x-axis on this chart, that this is actually the Fed's balance sheet in 1914, not 2014. And part of the reason why I laugh about that is because it's identical, right? I mean, we're looking at the exact same thing effectively that we just saw in terms of the Fed rapidly expanding its balance sheet. So maybe you can speak to the chart that I just posted. I'm about to post it into the nest here. I apologize. There we go. I'm so excited. I figured out how to use posting into the nest. There we go. Okay, so this chart from 1914 to 1920 shows what, Richard?
It shows the Fed's total assets. Now, the total assets of the Fed or any central bank tell us more or less how much money the Fed has created. And when the Fed opened its doors for business in November 2014, its total assets were $250 million. But just 6 years later, by the end of 2020, they had increased from 250 million to 6 billion. Now, this was something that the creators of the Fed had not intended or ever imagined anything like this would be possible. But why did this occur? The Fed it was founded by Congress in 1913. It didn't open its doors for business until 1914. And of course, in 1914, World War I started. The U.S. didn't enter the war until 1917. Still, the Fed was called upon to help the United States government finance its expenditure in World War I so that the country could win the war. And that's what it did. And as a result, it created a lot of money. And that's why its assets exploded from 250 million to 6 billion in just its first 6 years of operation.
So effectively, the Fed is I mean, just to lay this out there in like the easiest possible form, almost immediately after being created, the Fed moved from an organization that was focused around providing a lender of last resort to the banking system to becoming the financing mechanism of the U.S. government.
Or to be an important facilitator in financing U.S. government debt. The facilitator of last resort could create as much money as necessary when the war.
I don't know if other people had challenges hearing you. You came through garbled for me. Would you mind repeating that, please?
Yes, so the Fed became the facilitator financing the government's debt, and it was able to get as much money as necessary to enable the U.S. government to borrow money cheaply and invest that money in armaments so that the United States could win the war. It happened in World War I, and it happened again in World War II.
Now, when you say invest the money, right? So part of what was actually happening, if I just mechanically run through this dynamic, it was the US government choosing to extend credit to European governments and providing them with armaments and then ultimately paying for the deployment of soldiers. All of that had to be, all of that required money to effectively go into the economy. There were two ways that you could finance that. One was through participation from the public, through things like war bonds, et cetera, people choosing to give up their current consumption to contribute to the war effort. But part of your point was even at that stage, it was so clear and so evident that the needs of the US government for financing the war were so much greater than could be pulled just on a discretionary basis out of the economy that they had to do this effectively. Is that a reasonable interpretation of it?
Yes, that's right. We normally think about the Fed creating money, which is true. Money is defined, base money is defined as Federal Reserve notes or currency in circulation, plus bank reserves. And the Fed does create bank reserves. That's part of the base money. So the Fed does create money. But it's actually more useful to think about the Fed extending credit, Federal Reserve credit, rather than creating money. Because when you think of it in terms of the Fed creating credit, then that really is exactly what the Fed is doing. It is extending credit. And in this case, it extended enough credit to banks to enable the banks to buy government bonds and finance the war that way.
So it seems like a silly distinction, right? The difference between the Fed buying the bonds and the banks buying the bonds. Why would you choose to do it through the banks as compared to simply printing the money and putting it in the hands of, soldiers, for example, or weapons manufacturers?
The politicians the congressmen who created the Fed and put the charter of the Fed together, they were afraid the Fed would have too much power, and they did not want the Fed to directly finance U.S. government borrowing. They wanted the Fed to be the lender of last resort to the banking sector, so that if there was a sudden banking panic and all of the depositors ran to their banks and withdrew their deposits, that could have the potential to create a Great Depression, as it had done in 1907, which was the final crisis that really prompted the politicians to create the Fed. So the purpose was to provide short-term lending to the banks in times of banking panics to prevent the banking panic from turning into a credit collapse that would lead to a Great Depression. The founders of the Fed, the creators of the Fed, didn't want the Fed funding and financing government borrowing. So they set it up in such a way that it was difficult for the Fed to provide funding directly to the government.
So now that seems like an important distinction, and it seems like that is a legacy of the Fed that has carried through to this day. When we talk about things like quantitative easing, it has to be done through the banking system. Does that continue to be true in your analysis?
That's right. Even now, the Fed does not buy bonds directly from the U.S. government. What happens is first the U.S. government sells its bonds to the public, which tends to be primarily to the banks. And then the banks accumulate these government bonds. And the Fed, when it does quantitative easing, for example, the Fed buys the government bonds from the banks, and it pays for them by making deposits into the bank accounts that all the banks hold at the Fed. These are called reserve accounts, and the money in the reserve accounts are bank reserves. So it extends Federal Reserve credit by making deposits into the bank accounts that the banks hold at the Fed. That is credit that it's extending indirectly to the US government because it's buying US government bonds. So indirectly, it's providing credit to the US government to allow the government to do whatever it needs to do, fight the war, bail out the banks during 2008, or provide the stimulus during the pandemic of 2020. But that's how it works. That's how the Fed does this.
Okay, and I just want to emphasize though, because this is actually important, and there's a couple of things that you hit on here that tend to fall into the kind of tinfoil hat dynamics, right? The initial capital that set up the Fed was contributions from private banking institutions that were doing the equivalent of FDIC investment, right? They were effectively saying, alongside the federal government, which also invested, they were saying, this creates value for the banking system, this system of insurance. So we will commit an element of capital to that. That's why we see the bank as theoretically owned by the private sector, although that is a myth. It is not a private sector entity. It does not return profits to its members, etc. It is a public entity that effectively is having its value subsidized by the banking system. Is that a fair characterization?
Yes, and it's important to point out that the Fed is extraordinarily, or up until this year, the Fed is extraordinarily profitable, and it's required to hand over all of its profits to the government at the end of every year. So altogether, since it was created, the Fed has handed over $1.8 trillion to the US government coming out of its profits. All of its profits have gone to the US government. So that's reduced the US government debt by more than $1.8 trillion because, of course, the government would have had to pay interest on that accumulated $1.8 trillion that the Fed funded. So just a couple of years ago, I think 2021 probably, the Fed, I believe, earned $110 billion of profit, making it the most, if it had been a corporation, it would have been the most profitable corporation in the world that year. And all those profits go to the government, U.S. taxpayers.
Now, one of the charts that I put up in the Nest, the latest one, highlights the ratio of gold reserves versus federal Fed reserves. It's effectively the ratio of how backed the Fed is by gold. And most people tend to think about the gold standard as being fixed. In other words, you could exchange a US dollar for, I forget the exact number of grams of gold. But it was literally convertible into. But part of what you're highlighting here is that did not in turn mean that there was a fixed quantity of gold in the system relative to the quantity of credit that was out there.
That's right. The quantity of gold in the country fluctuated two main ways. Of course, new gold could be dug up in Alaska, for instance, or California or Nevada. And when that occurred, that gold would get deposited in the U.S. banking system. And as it was deposited, since the banks were required to hold a certain portion of their deposits at the Fed as bank reserves in accordance with the required reserve ratio, that increased the amount of gold held by the Fed. The other main way that gold in the Fed fluctuated, and this is what we see in the chart you put up here, starting in the 1930s especially. In your chart, you can see the gold reserve ratio. That means how much gold the Fed had relative to the amount of money that it had created. The Fed was required to hold a certain amount of gold relative to all the money it created. It's a bit, let's skip over the details, but let's say it's 40% gold cover was required, meaning the Fed had to have $40 worth of gold for every $100 worth of Federal Reserve credit it created, or Federal Reserve notes that it extended. Now, so what we see here in the sort of the last 40%, toward the last 40% of this chart, is the gold cover ratio goes up very sharply. And the reason it goes up very sharply during the latter half of the 1930s is because Japan was taking over Asia, and the Chinese were trying to get their money out of Asia, so they were sending it to the US to be safe. And the same thing was happening in Europe. The Nazis were taking over Europe, and everyone was trying to get their gold out of Europe, and they sent it to the US. It went on deposit in US banks, and that the banks were required to hold a certain percent of that at the Fed. So the Fed's gold stock increased very sharply, so that by the end of the 1930s, the Fed had almost 90% gold covering, whereas it was only required to have 40%, and technically a bit less than that. And so that meant that the US and the central bank was in an extremely good position when World War II started, because it had very high gold cover ratio, meaning that the Fed was in a position to create an extraordinarily large amount of Federal Reserve credit to help finance the war without endangering this legal requirement, that it hold 40% gold backing. Now, by the time the war ended, you can see the ratio was approaching 40% very quickly. And so at that point, Congress became a bit frightened that this wasn't going to work, and they reduced the required level of gold holdings from 40% to 25%. And so the Fed was only required to hold $25 worth of gold for every $100 of credit that it created, or money that it created. And that lasted until 1968. But by 1968, at that point, the Fed was right down to that 25% legal requirement, meaning that it couldn't issue one more dollar because it didn't have enough gold to back it. And at that point, Lyndon Johnson asked Congress to remove the gold backing requirement for the Fed, and Congress complied. And afterwards, there was no longer any requirement for the Fed to hold any gold whatsoever, at which point the Fed became this, and this is the point that sparked off the money revolution that I describe in my book. Afterwards, our economic system began to evolve because gold was no longer money, and the Fed was free to create as much money as it dared to do. And this created a number of new conditions that we had not experienced before. The most important of which is that trade no longer had to balance. Up until then, and of course, this was going back for hundreds of years, since gold had been money long before the Fed was created. But when in a gold-backed monetary system, a country couldn't have a big trade deficit, because if it had a very big trade deficit, it would have to pay for that deficit by handing its gold over to the surplus country. So in the 19th century, if England had a very big trade deficit with France, then England literally would have had to put its gold on a ship and send it to France. And since gold was money, England's money supply would have contracted very sharply. Therefore, they would have had a very severe depression. Unemployment would have skyrocketed, and they would have had deflation. And the opposite would have happened in France. They would have had more gold, so credit could have expanded. The economy would have boomed. There would have been full employment and lots of consumption. And there would have been inflation. And pretty soon, the rich French would start buying a lot of cheap English goods, and the poor unemployed English would stop buying so many French goods, and trade would come back into balance. There was an automatic adjustment mechanism that assured that trade between countries balanced. But put more simply,
I want to pause you for a second there, though, because that sounds like a great thing, right? I mean, shouldn't trade balance?
Well, that's the way it always worked up until Congress changed the law in 1968, and then Nixon destroyed the Bretton Woods system 3 years later in 1971. Now, is this a good thing? It's a good thing, I would argue, in the sense that it keeps everything in equilibrium, or it helps keep things in equilibrium. What we've seen after this arrangement broke down is that the U.S. started running extraordinarily large trade deficits soon afterwards. This system ended in 1968, 1971 when Bretton Woods collapsed. Starting in the early 1980s, the U.S. discovered that it could run extremely large trade deficits with the rest of the world, at that time primarily Japan and Germany, and get away with it. And it didn't have to pay with gold. They could just pay with paper dollars, or really more realistically, treasury bonds denominated in paper dollars. And so by the mid-1980s, the U.S. trade deficit was 3.5% of GDP. And that was causing problems in the surplus countries, because as these dollars went into Germany and Japan, it started blowing those countries into bubbles and causing inflation in the surplus countries. So at that point, all the leaders met at the Plaza Accord, I think in 85, 87 in New York, and agreed that the dollar would be devalued by 50% against the yen and the mark. And that worked. It brought trade back into balance by 1990. But then China entered the global economy, and all of the emerging markets in Asia started entering the global economy. And the U.S. trade deficit once again blew out to even larger levels. It hit 6% of GDP in 2006. That was $800 billion in that 1 year alone. So these trade deficits destabilized the global economy in a way that had not occurred before. But the benefit of this was that it became very disinflationary as the U.S. started buying things from countries with very low wage labor cost, like China.
So Richard, this is one of the areas where, you and I think, see things slightly differently. And I just want to spend a moment on this, because the chart that I just put into the nest, by the way, I just want to orient people to this. This is the chart that Richard is highlighting, where he's talking about as we moved to a system that was dependent upon reserves, the banking system, just like Richard is describing with the Federal Reserve was required to have a certain quantity of gold against any lending activity it did. Banks were required to have a certain level of reserves against their lending activity. Over time, we lowered the quantity of reserves that were required in the banking system in the exact same way that we lowered the quantity of gold that was required for the Federal Reserve. And part of what Richard is describing is that lifts the constraint, right? That removes a limit to the system. Now, that sounds like a stupid idea. Why in the world would you want to do that? Until you imagine, for example, raising a child. Right. So let's pretend that the United States was the only player left standing in 1945, which doesn't seem like a terrible point of view to have. And in the context of that, we decide, we need to help everybody else grow so that we can resume things being roughly normal. Right now, how do we do that with children? Well, we give them things until they're capable of standing on their own 2 feet. And once they're capable of standing on their own 2 feet, we hope that they are going to reciprocate in some form or another by paying in taxes that go to support our social security system, or by returning capital to us in the form of buying us various things in our dotage that they otherwise might not have, right? So the same thing happens with France and the United States, or the UK and the United States, where the United States is willing to lend the material to rebuild over this time period so that these entities are not only capable of consuming our production, but of eventually producing their own components, their own goods and services that they can then in turn offer to us to make them attractive. But that process of getting there, right, could very well require us to extend them credit for an extended period of time, just like we have to with our children. Right now, again, I do a terrible job of picking out analogs that often offend the hell out of people. So I just want to clarify, do not think of Europe or Japan or Germany or the UK as the children of the United States, but I'm using that analogy of an extended credit relationship with an uncertain return benefit for fairly obvious reasons, right? So those are reasons why you may not want to be limited by that. If the United States tried to engage in trade with, the Solomon Islands, for example, we would find out that they want a ton more from us than we actually want from them. The terms of trade are not remotely equal in their characterization. But if we allow the Solomon Islands to invest in itself, eventually they may be able to become robust enough in a certain area that we can begin to trade as equals. Now that's the hope. That's the idea. But what Richard is identifying is along that path, most players became dependent upon selling to the United States. Michael Pettis has done a better job of anyone else of describing this. The challenge is not for the United States, right? It's not that the United States actually needs the production from China. It's that China needs the ability to employ its people to sell stuff, and in order to do that at the levels that they currently do, they have to be able to sell to the United States. So in exchange for selling us goods and services, and in exchange for the US government providing the safety of transport that allows a large loaded ship, a container ship, to transit and navigate the ocean, right? They turn around and say, we're going to buy your treasuries. We're going to buy these semi-worthless things so that we can continue to sell to you, because otherwise we have nothing to do with our people. The flip side of that is, as Richard is saying, like if we took that away, the yuan would very rapidly appreciate versus the US, and suddenly Chinese workers would find themselves without employment because they would no longer be competitively capable of servicing the needs of the United States. Yes, the prices would probably be higher for Americans, but we'd go back to building cars in Detroit. We'd go back to building furniture in North Carolina, et cetera. Richard, is there anything I said that you strongly disagree with?
No, I think I agree with everything you said, but like with so many things in the global economy, there are so many factors at play. Here are a few more. When the World War II ended, we lent Europe a lot of money through the Marshall Plan to try to reignite their economy. And that was very successful. But a little bit later on, we realized that rather than just lending the money directly, we could let them have a big trade surplus with us. For example, with our allies, Japan. We wanted to shore up Japan so it wouldn't be communist and could be an ally in the East. And then we did the same with Taiwan and South Korea. And a little bit later, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, and so on. And later on, China and Vietnam. And we didn't do this entirely, just because we're kind-hearted. U.S. corporations realized that they could massively enhance their profit margins if they produce things in countries like Vietnam and China with extremely low labor cost. So I moved to Hong Kong and started my career in 1986, and very quickly went across the border to China and saw factories as far as the eye could see, full of 19-year-old women earning $3 a day. So things just started to evolve for a number of reasons. But one of the most powerful reasons was U.S. corporations realized under the capitalist model that they could make more money if they fired their workers in America and shut down their factories in America and just made everything in China. And that's what happened. And now China has a $1 billion a day trade surplus with the U.S. And this, as a result, largely of the U.S. trade deficit that China has enjoyed since 1990, they've grown into a superpower that now threatens our global preeminence and therefore national security.
Now, this is a slightly different focus and statement, but I do want to make sure that we captured that. What you're describing is actually a situation where the American corporations recognize two things. One is if I go to China and I put in place a factory in which I employ Chinese workers at much lower wages, and I'm able to export the goods produced under that relationship back to the United States, then I'm able to make a ton of profits. But there's a whole bunch of, ifs that are there that have to be supported by the U.S. government.
Right. And so for instance, the Fed steadily reduced the reserve requirements that the banks were required to maintain, which freed them up to create more and more and more credit. So what we've seen, maybe starting from the 1980s, is that even though, or even the 70s, even though wages in the US were stagnant, the American workers were able to obtain more and more credit from banks or from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, or one way or the other. And by borrowing more and more credit, they were able to continue to enjoy an improving lifestyle. And this resulted ultimately in the property bubble, for instance, which then blew up when many of these people couldn't repay the credit that they had borrowed.
Right. So before we jump to the property bubble, let's start with the first parts of it, right? Which is, if I'm going back to those American corporations that are then going over to China, they've fired the American worker. They've gone to China where they're able to manufacture the product much more cheaply. China is keeping its currency weak by accepting treasuries in exchange for the surplus that they're running, right? So they're buying a quote unquote good that you can basically think of as vaporware. The US government is benefiting because you now have a subsidized buyer of US Treasury bonds who is choosing to buy them for economic reasons other than purely the interest that they receive on those bonds. They're not just looking at it as a good investment in terms of the US being a good credit or the interest rate being particularly a credit, being an attractive level versus the rest of the world. They're saying this is a great deal for us because we get to continue to employ our people selling goods to the Americans.
That's right. But in order to make that happen, they had to intervene very aggressively in their foreign exchange market to keep their currency from appreciating. Otherwise, let's use the example of China. As I mentioned earlier, China has a $1 billion a day trade surplus with the United States. So Chinese companies sell their goods in the United States. They get paid in dollars. They take those dollars back to China, and they want to convert them into the local currency, the Chinese yuan. But if they converted that many dollars into yuan, of course, the yuan would appreciate very radically, and a much higher exchange rate would have killed China's economic growth, which was led by export-led growth. And so China would have stopped growing at some point in the 1990s, and it would look nothing like it does today. But in order to perpetuate its export-led growth model, the central bank intervened, and the central bank bought all of the dollars coming into China at a fixed exchange rate. And therefore, it held the exchange rate low. So China continued to be extremely competitive. In other words, flying in the face of market forces and everything that should have happened and would have happened under a gold standard. Now, so in this process, China ended up accumulating $4 trillion of foreign exchange reserves, mostly dollars. And once they had these dollars, they had to do something with them if they wanted to earn any interest on them. Therefore, they invested in...
I actually want to be clear that it's actually not even a question of if they wanted to earn interest. If we had issued those bonds with zero interest, they still would have had to buy them, or they would have seen their currency appreciate versus the US dollar.
That's right. Or they, of course, they would have tried to buy something else, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac bonds, or corporate debt, perhaps, or even stocks or U.S. property, the way the Japanese did when they were in a similar position in the 80s.
But in every situation, you end up getting a subsidy to the U.S., whether it's going to the government, whether it's going to corporations, whether it's going to owners of real assets in the form of Rockefeller Center, et cetera. They don't actually have a choice. If they don't want their currency to appreciate, they have to buy stuff from us.
That's right.
And treasuries are just the largest, most liquid component.
That's right. Some people may be thinking, well, they don't really have to. They could sell their dollars and buy euros, exchange their dollars for euros, for instance. And that's true, but whoever they bought the euros from, they would then have dollars, and they would have to invest those dollars in treasuries. So dollars are like farmland. The farmer can sell his farmland, but it doesn't make the farmland disappear. Someone else owns it. So yes, this creates big subsidies This enables the US government to borrow much more cheaply than it would have been able to do otherwise. And at the same time, by buying goods from such low wage workers in China and Vietnam and now Bangladesh, this is extremely disinflationary. It's driven down the inflation rate. In the early 1980s, it was near 20%, and now, in recent years, it's dipped below zero from time to time, up until the COVID pandemic. So it's been extraordinarily disinflationary, and as inflation came down, interest rates came down. And as interest rates came down in the US, it made credit more affordable. And so credit proliferated, credit growth exploded, and credit growth became the main driver of economic growth in the United States, to the point now where the country is addicted to credit growth. And if credit doesn't grow, the economy doesn't grow. And if credit contracts, the US goes into depression.
So one of the challenges in these types of discussions, and there's no way we're sticking within our 1 hour budget. I apologize to my wife who suggested that and to everybody else. One of the challenges with using the language that you're using is it implies a component of judgment, right? We tend to operate under a Protestant model. The German language for debt is guilt, and people hear credit and they think, oh, bad word, right? I just want to reemphasize what you're describing is a system that has to balance. If we take away the income from American workers and we hand it to Chinese, and in turn we want to buy the goods that they're now producing without the income associated with it, the only choice is to make credit available to those individuals. And the provision of that credit allows those individuals to buy it. This is what Michael Pettis and Matt Klein mean when they say trade wars are class wars. The money is flowing, the profits of these entities are flowing to the wealthy, while the workers who traditionally would have built this stuff and might have been able to say, I'm only willing to do it for much higher wages, are suddenly forced into a situation where they're required to borrow in order to maintain consumption. And not only are they required to maintain that consumption, they're encouraged to increase that consumption because the Chinese want to sell their stuff, right? So the Japanese before them, the Chinese today, the Germans prior to the global financial crisis, they're all subsidizing the creation of credit in the United States in order to keep the United States purchasing their goods. It's vendor financing.
That's right. And it has contributed to this very sharp increase in income inequality that we've seen over the last several decades. But one other point to add in here is that income inequality has expanded everywhere in the world. But in the developing countries like China, this system that we've been discussing, this explosion of credit and these extraordinarily large US trade deficits, this has pulled hundreds of millions of people out of poverty at the bottom end of the scale, as they have manufacturing jobs instead of having to work at subsistence jobs in rice paddies, for instance. So from a global perspective, the global poor have benefited from this enormously, along with the global rich. It's just the US Americans who have, and perhaps Europeans to a certain extent, have not done as well. In fact, they've stagnated, leading to a great deal of resentment in politics in the US.
So these are all very challenging topics, right? Because we need to evaluate many trade-offs. One is, yes, it's an absolutely good thing for Chinese peasants to be lifted out of poverty, abject poverty. I mean, beyond abject poverty. If we go back and you look at China, not when you went over, but if you go back and you look at China when Nixon goes to China, the average Chinese is barely surviving. Barely, I mean, truly, truly barely surviving. If I remember the statistics correctly, they're operating on something like 1,400 calories a day.
Right. I think 30 to 50 million Chinese starved to death in the early 1960s.
Correct. And the reason why they starved is the classic dynamics of collectivism and a command control architecture in which a local government official is unwilling to admit that he's failed, and as a result is more than willing to allow the local population to starve because they ship the grain or the rice or whatever to the central granaries rather than admit that they lied about the productive capacity of their local region. Right. So
Right,
these are,
the madness of Chairman Mao in his old age.
well, but again, like I just want to emphasize, it's not, I mean, Mao's a terrible guy, don't get me wrong, and his wife is probably even worse. Um, but the reality is he did not direct millions of people to die. It was the local politician who said, well, I could tell the truth and then I would be sent to jail. My family would be punished, and things would end up terribly for me, or I can tell a little lie and some of the local peasants will die. Right? That dynamic is really what transpired. I would suggest that something very similar happened in the United States, where our elite economists told us the lie of free trade and said, hey, this is fantastic. Nobody loses. Everybody ends up winning from free trade. Anyone who lived in Detroit or who lived in many of the regions in the United States in which the manufacturing centers were displaced by Chinese competition. And I don't want to pick on China per se, because the same thing's true when we send it to Vietnam or India or anywhere else. Um, they were effectively sold a bill of goods, right? You're going to be better off because of this. They were not.
Right, the idea of free trade being a net good for everyone is another one of those economic theories from the past that were developed when gold was money and when trade between countries had to balance. Once that constraint was eliminated, things didn't work. Things no longer worked the way they did in the past.
Okay, now one of the really critical components that you're hitting on here is this dynamic of the role of foreign central banks. And so I just put up a slide and I'm going to post it into the thread hitting on exactly this topic. Give me 1 second here to catch up. Okay. Just posted it into the nest. Okay, so this is the dynamic of credit creation by foreign central banks. You've spoken on this a little bit. Could you expand on this a little bit, what you mean by the role that this played?
Right, so when you look at total foreign exchange reserves in the world, or the foreign exchange reserves of any country, what does that mean? Well, it's a very clear indicator of how much money the central banks of those countries have created, because they are foreign exchange reserves. How does a country accumulate foreign exchange reserves? They buy the foreign exchange of a different country. The central bank does. And where does the central bank get the money to buy other countries' currencies? They are central banks. They just create it from thin air. So this is very much like quantitative easing, which we're all familiar with now. With quantitative easing, the Fed creates money and it buys government bonds, US government bonds, and that pushes up the price of the government bond and that pushes down the yield of the government bond. That's the purpose of it. Now, let's say the PBOC, the China Central Bank, it's exactly the same thing, except it involves one additional step. Step one, the PBOC creates its own money, yuan. Step two, it takes those yuan and buys US dollars to keep its currency from appreciating. And then step three, it takes those dollars and buys US Treasury bonds. So it's just like quantitative easing with one more step involved. And that's what the central banks have been doing, really beginning from the time that trade stopped balancing from the early 80s. And countries like Japan, of course, with the largest trade surpluses, and China and Taiwan and almost all of the countries with very large trade surpluses, they have done this. And it resulted in, now I think there are roughly $12 trillion, maybe $13 trillion of foreign exchange reserves in the world. up from just 2 trillion at the turn of the century, suggesting that foreign central banks have created 11 or 12, 10 or 11 or 12 trillion dollars of money. Compare that with the Fed. The Fed's total assets peaked at just under 9 trillion. And we know the impact that the creation of all that money by the Fed has had on the US economy and the global economy and asset prices. But foreign central banks have created even more money than that, as you can see by looking at their total foreign exchange reserves, 12 or 13 trillion dollars now. And so this has had, and in fact, this has subsidized, as you said earlier in the conversation, US government borrowing. But at times it's created big problems for the US government. Sometimes the central banks of countries like China have created so much money and bought so many dollars, and with those dollars bought so many treasury bonds that it pushed the treasury bond prices up and drove down their yields at a time when the Fed didn't want their yields to go lower. For instance, between 2004, the middle of 2004 and the middle of 2006, the Fed started tightening the federal funds rate in order to try to cool down the US property market. And over those 24 months, the Fed increased the federal funds rate from 1% to 5.25%. In other words, 425 basis points. That's a lot of tightening over 2 years. That should have pushed up the 10-year bond yields and the mortgage rates and everything else. But because China in particular was buying so many dollars, and with those dollars buying so many treasury bonds during that period, that pushed up the price of the treasury bonds and pushed down their yields. And this caused the Fed to lose control over interest rates. The Fed couldn't force US interest rates to go higher and therefore cool down the property market because of all of this paper money creation by the PBOC and other central banks. So the Fed lost control over interest rates. It couldn't stop the property bubble from forming, and it blew up in 2008 and almost crashed the global financial system and creating a new Great Depression, and would have had the government not intervened aggressively by running trillion-dollar budget deficits and the Fed financing those deficits with multi-trillion-dollar money creation during the first 3 rounds of quantitative easing, none of which would have been possible under a gold standard.
Well, so again, I want to be careful because when you say none of which would be possible without a gold standard, it tends to associate a dynamic of judgment to it, right? We've been living in some irrational framework. Part of what I tried to introduce early on was that this is actually not an irrational framework whatsoever, to the extent you think that you're building something where you're ultimately going to end up benefiting from a bilateral trade dynamic. But when it's abused in the way that it has been to provide employment for the rest of the world at the expense of Nebraska, for example, it becomes an abusive system that ultimately is not sustainable. Is that
right?
Reasonable?
Yes, I suppose I am imposing these judgments just to emphasize, support the theme of the book, that a money revolution has occurred. These things would not have been possible without this money revolution. So I'm not so much necessarily condemning it, but I'm just trying to describe the way the economy actually works now so that we can understand that this is not the way it used to work. It's not working in accordance with classical economic theory. We have a new economic system now. And it's very important that we understand the way it works and try to master it. Because if we don't understand it, and for instance, try to balance the budget and reduce debt, if we start reducing debt and credit in the country, the economy is going to collapse into a depression. So we need to understand that our economy now is driven by credit growth and requires credit growth to grow. That may sound unpleasant and sinful to the people with the Protestant work ethic and a large faction of Austrian economists. But this is just the way it is. We have to deal with the economy the way it is now. Do we want it to collapse into a Great Depression? I would think everyone should say no. I mean, many people think that it's inevitable. And therefore, since we have sinned, we must pay the price of sin.
Hmm.
and eat our medicine and just suffer accordingly. It'll be a rough couple of 2 years, and then everything will be back to normal. We'll be back in some sort of laissez-faire Garden of Eden. But that's completely untrue. We have the biggest credit bubble imaginable, not only in the US, but globally. If this thing implodes, our civilization won't survive. It will be not only a replay of the Great Depression, it'll be a replay of the 1930s and probably the 1940s with a nuclear weapons twist thrown on top.
Well, usually I'm the
So,
doom and gloom guy. So Richard, you just topped something that I was going to say, but I do want to emphasize that like this is actually a recognition of the core issue that we face, right? It's not that the individual who lives in Detroit who is using a credit card to allow themselves to continue to make ends meet, despite the fact that their employment opportunities make that credit card difficult to justify, right? We've removed choice from those individuals by engaging in the geopolitical dynamics that we are, by choosing to engage in trade with China and allowing China to subsidize its political model by providing work to its population, by buying treasuries, etc. We're creating conditions under which credit is the only mechanism that is actually available to that household. Right now, each individual household may have a slightly different outcome, and I think that's important to specify. But in aggregate, they're forced into this situation.
yes, I agree entirely. I would just add one comment to that. You said we are creating this. I understand what you mean, but I would like to add, I think it's not so much we're creating it, this is how it has evolved. And when it has hit a crisis, then the government does intervene to prevent the implosion occurring immediately. But we didn't create this on purpose. When we broke the link between dollars and gold, our economic system started evolving in ways that were not possible before. And it's brought us to this point now where we have a very big global credit bubble in the US and globally. And if it implodes, it's going to be a fall of Rome type scenario, I'm afraid. And so we can't
Well,
let that happen.
this is actually why I draw the distinction between the fall of Rome in the Gibbons sense and the fall of Rome in the end of the Republic sense. So the fall of Rome in the Gibbon sense is the invasion of Rome by barbarian tribes who have gained access to Rome itself and are able to force a significant physical change. The story of the end of the Roman Republic was one that happened internally when a credit-based system and a retirement system broke down, causing extraordinary social unrest and effectively creating a civil war. That, I think, is the far more likely outcome because what we've created is a system in which we blame the individual in Detroit for being a deplorable and for not participating. And at the same time, we look at the elite, and I use that term with some hesitancy because I just want to be very clear. I'm not actually trying to foment class conflict. I'm highlighting the arrogance and lack of understanding that exists when the Hollywood producer says, guess what? We need to enforce property rights in the form of copyright protections against piracy in China. The individual in Hollywood has an exportable good that they're able to sell to the Chinese who have growing wealth or have a product that they can receive funding and financing from the elite within China who are profiting from the dynamics of the system in place. When we choose to enforce their rights over the individual's rights in Detroit to make an income, we're making a very tangible choice in which we're choosing who are the winners and losers. That's one of the reasons why I push back so hard against people who are deciding that they're going to engage in some sort of discussion around, well, I don't want the government picking winners and losers. You're insane. They already are.
Well, that's right. And in this book, as I mentioned, three parts. First part, the history of the Fed. The second part, the history of credit, over the last century or so, how it's evolved and how the economy has become dependent on credit creation. But so the book spans 120 years. The first two parts, 110 years of history. The last part looks 10 years into the future. So while you have pointed out that my view is extremely pessimistic, my point is not to end there. It is to look for solutions. The whole point of this book is not to say we're all frickin' doomed, as so many people do. It's to say, yes, we have our economic system is a big credit bubble, and there are certainly real threats, extreme threats, things that could go terribly wrong. So we have to find out how to prevent that from happening. We have to learn how our new economic system works, which is what is explained in parts 1 and 2, and then we have to make the most of these new opportunities. Because I really believe that this new economic system that we have now, I call it creditism rather than capitalism. I really believe this new economic system that we have, a system that allows the government to borrow trillions of dollars and for the Fed to finance trillions of dollars with paper money creation. This is a unique moment in history. And if the government takes advantage of this by financing investment in new industries and new technologies on a very aggressive scale, then this could lead to an extraordinary technological revolution that would not only prevent the economy from collapsing, but it would radically enhance human well-being, not only for Americans, but for everyone around the world, and shore up U.S. national security for generations to come if we invest in new industries and new technologies on a large enough scale, which we can easily afford to do, in my opinion, over the next decade.
So now this is one of these interesting situations in which you and I say the exact same thing. I think there's some interesting wrinkles of difference, and we can touch on those. But before we move to the hopeful view of the future, I just want to add one more component to creditism, which is the slide that I just put in, which is saying the system has changed. So what was originally a system that extended credit to the banking system by removing the reliance on reserves and effectively creating conditions under which banks themselves really did not face any form of reserve requirement in the same way that you're identifying in the late 1960s, the Federal Reserve no longer had any gold requirement. That system really began to break down in the face of the trade dynamics that you're highlighting and has hit kind of a local apogee around the global financial crisis, where Germans who were selling us automobiles or high quality toilets and ovens and dishwashers, et cetera, for our housing finance bubble, were providing the credit for that housing construction in the form of, interest rates that were much lower than we would have otherwise anticipated. That manifested itself in the rise of a terribly named shadow banking system, right? Richard, can you expand on that just a little bit? And again,
Yes.
I just want to keep emphasizing for people, you hear me use that tone. I'm trying to demystify debt. I'm trying to remove the judgment from it because it's just a mechanism of balancing the system, right? It may not be the right way of balancing the system. We can have debates around whether we should have quote unquote free trade in the manner that we're describing. But once you decide you're going to do that, you have to allow the system to balance if there are bad actors in the system that are not willing to allow the system to naturally balance as it would under a credit-based system, just like it did under the gold system, if there weren't other central banks trying to manipulate it.
Right. So yes, not only did bank credit creation explode as the Fed steadily reduced the required reserve ratio, enabling the banking system to create more and more money. And by the way, the required reserve ratio is now 0% for the banks. There is no required reserve ratio, which would, in theory, at least imply the banks can create an infinite supply of credit. But your question was about the non-banks. And So not only did bank credit explode, but on an even much greater scale, non-bank credit exploded. Up until the 50s or 60s, the banks provided all the credit, and that was based on the deposits that they were receiving. But as new institutions emerged, they became the major suppliers of credit. This was led by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and secondly, by issuers of asset-backed securities. They provided, they became both very large borrowers and very large creditors. And as they expanded more and more credit, at some points they borrowed more in certain years than the U.S. government did on many occasions. And when they borrowed the money, they then relent the money, pumping money into the U.S. economy, and most notably, blowing the U.S. property market into a bubble in 2004, 5, 6, 7, and with that all blowing up in 2008. But there were a dozen other smaller types of institutions, things like mutual funds and money market funds, which hadn't existed before, finance companies, security brokers and dealers, funding corporations, closed-end funds, holding companies, exchange-traded funds. All of these things emerged and pumped credit into the economy. And that credit grew so rapidly that our economic system changed. The way that our economic system, the dynamic driving our economic system changed. It evolved. It's no longer capitalism, in my opinion. Capitalism evolved into what I call creditism. Under capitalism, the growth dynamic that drove the economy was this. Businessmen would invest. Some of them would make a profit. They would save that profit, or in other words, accumulate capital, hence capitalism, and repeat, saving and investment. That was the dynamic that drove capitalism. It was pretty difficult. That's not the way our economic system is driven anymore. The dynamic that drives our system now is credit creation and consumption, more credit creation and more consumption. And this has tended to be significantly easier. And as I said, has pulled hundreds of millions of people around the world out of poverty. But the problem with creditism is it requires credit growth to survive. If credit doesn't grow, the U.S. goes into recession. In fact, if credit grows by less than 2% adjusted for inflation, the U.S. has a recession. And if credit contracts meaningfully, or even a couple of percentage points, the chances are high, without government intervention, the U.S. would go into a depression. And that's what we started to see in 2009.
Right. So now this is, for the audience listening, this is one of the areas where Richard and I disagree. So Richard will say something like, and by the way, I want to be very clear. I could be wrong. He could be right. Richard will say, if it grows less than 2%, right? Now, my reaction to that is one, to immediately be a contrarian and say, well, what if it grows 1.95%, right? And what Richard is highlighting is that he is an empiricist who's basically looked back in the past and said, this is the level at which things have gone wrong. And my view on that is, yes, that may have been true then. It might actually be higher today. It might actually be lower. There's any number of reasons why that could be different. And everything ranging from the distribution of income, wealth, et cetera, affects that. Right? What really is.
I agree with you, Michael. That's exactly right. I mean, but if I'd tried to put in all of those conditions, I would have lost my audience. I've got to lay out the big message.
Not to be horribly offensive, but like your audience is like 27 people and somebody in Thailand, right? Like, not like, I just want to be really clear. The fact that we live in a world in which people are spending a lot of time debating monetary systems and discussing this is a particular, first world problem sort of thing, right? There's people all over the world who are just trying to figure out how to provide adequate nutrition for their families. They're much less interested in debating the intricacies of monetary systems. So we're automatically moving into a very, narrow audience. It just happens to be that we live in an era of affluence, so there's enough people to make it worth our while to do those sorts of things.
Well, I
But
want my
but I
audience to be the 600 people in the House and the Senate, and I want to
well
persuade them.
exactly.
But but
So
so the
but
way I got to this 2% credit growth adjusted for inflation is looking back to 1950. Every time credit adjusted for inflation grew by less than 2%, the U.S. went into recession. And the recession didn't, that was between, that happened 9 times between 1952 and 2009. And so you're right. I mean, is it 2%? Is it 2.5%? Is it 1.5%? But the point is, generally, it indicates that we need credit growth for the economy to grow. Credit is the thing driving the economic growth, and without it, we have a big problem.
so I'm going to toss in a little wrinkle on that, which is that, an overlapping generations model. Um, John Giancopoulos and others are kind of the academic leaders in this sort of stuff. Um, what you're describing from an empirical framework, I think, is an accurate description of the world of the 20th century, in which the quantity of human beings was growing so rapidly that for us to provide them with purchasing power, which they needed to obtain the goods and capital, human capital, that they required to adequately participate in the system, had to be basically done up front. Right? If I want a job in New York City, I need an apartment in New York City. I need a suit. I need a dishwasher to wash the dishes. I need a car to allow me to get downtown. Maybe that's a taxi, et cetera. But all of these things have to be built in advance of my participation of the system. We can't simply, say, well, you're going to do it, and then you're eventually going to be able to afford these things. Right? So creditism is a requirement in a system in which the quantity of people is growing really rapidly. If I extend that into a system in which the quantity of people grows much less rapidly or begins to shrink, I can actually start to pay that down, right? Because I don't need as much investment for the next generation, and I can require the older generation who has accumulated significant assets to pay more for it, right? That's the way the system is supposed to be solved. But if we introduce things like a Federal Reserve that says, oh no, it's totally unacceptable for us to pay higher wages to people because that really ticks off the capital class, then I actually do start to create elements of crisis in the system. And that's again, like part of what I'm trying to highlight for people. The system can be balanced, and it has elements of balancing naturally. But the minute we start to interject activism that says, well, what worked in the past has to be the right answer, it begins to break. So that's
The
one of
democ-
my particular fears.
right. The democracy makes it difficult for to balance. I mean, you can say it, there are ways to make it balance, but if you can't get the people to vote for higher taxes, then it doesn't work. And and
Uh,
then the government finds itself in a position of, well, here we are, we can't have higher taxes, so it means the government's going to have higher debt and much more borrowing, and that's how they got out of the crisis of 2008. That's how they got through the pandemic, and that's how China's revving up its economy right now again, by having more government debt and pumping it into the economy and making the credit growth drive the economic growth.
so the thing I love about that, right? I mean, first of all, you're 100% correct. The second part of it, though, is if you're going to have a representative democracy, you ultimately have to decide that you're going to trust people with the truth. And I think that is one of the key sins that we're currently involved with is the Jean-Claude Juncker framework of when it's really important, you have to lie. Bullshit. Tell people the truth, right? Like I'm sorry, that's part of the reason why people hear me speak up in the way that I do. Tell people the truth. If they can't handle it, that's totally separate. But I just don't believe that. I genuinely don't believe that if people are adequately informed as to the way the system actually works, I think that they're going to end up in a much better place. Okay. Um, I think that's a great place to start to open this up. Richard, actually, before I do that, can you just very quickly say, like, the way this is where you and I again align. The point of your book in the last chapter, looking at the future, is your argument is we've seen empirical evidence that we can use this power to make investments without adverse consequences. And those investments take on an important level of urgency, particularly when we're competing with somebody like China. Um, and AI is one of these areas that you liken effectively to nuclear weapons. You're saying we're in a space race similar to the Sputnik space race with the Russians. Mike Green's view, is that China is an absolute paper tiger with one possible exception. If they are first to artificial generalized intelligence, that becomes a force multiplier in the exact same way that a nuclear weapon is. It's effectively an ability to magnify your force so that nobody can compete with you, right? You're forced to surrender. Is that a fair characterization of how you see this competition and why you say it's so important that we embrace this now and effectively engage in a space race to raise the technological content of the United States so that we're able to win this battle?
So yes, so the book again is called The Money Revolution: How to Finance the Next American Century. So we go through 110 years of history, and we study history to make better decisions for the present. And what this history shows us is that it is possible for the US government to borrow on a multi-trillion-dollar scale, and for the Fed to finance this borrowing on a multi-trillion-dollar scale without the sky collapsing. And therefore, what I'm proposing in this book, in the third part of the book, is that the US government finance, in cooperation with the private sector, a multi-trillion-dollar investment program over the next decade, investing in new industries and technologies such as artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotech, nanotech, genetic engineering, neurosciences, green energy, and the others that you can imagine. And if they do this, this would turbocharge US economic growth, radically accelerate US productivity, improve the income of every class of Americans. And not only that, it would produce technological miracles and medical breakthroughs, truly giving us the opportunity to cure all the diseases and radically expand life expectancy, rehabilitate the environment, and overcome many of the greatest challenges that confront humanity today, all at the same time that it would ensure that the US maintains its military primacy so that we are not overtaken by China. And China is on the verge of overtaking us now. And if China in the year 2000, the United States invested 8 times more than China did in research and development. In 2019, China caught up. And if current rates of growth continue, within a decade, in 1 year, a decade from now, they will invest 40% more than the United States does. If the United States allows that to happen, then China is going to develop artificial general intelligence before the United States does. I mean, everybody's talking about Chat GPT now, right? You can just see where this is going. It's not going to take long before the artificial intelligence is creating weapons that are unimaginably superior to the ones that we have at the moment. Whoever gets there first wins. And China is going to get there first if the US doesn't radically increase its investment in new industries and technologies, which we could so easily do. For instance, just in 3 months, in the second quarter of 2020, US government debt increased by $2.8 trillion. And during that same time, the Fed created $2.9 trillion to finance that borrowing at low interest rates. So that is a multi-trillion-dollar borrowing spree in 90 days. I'm not proposing a multi-trillion-dollar investment program to occur over 90 days. I'm advocating that it occur over a decade and be introduced gradually, with the government borrowing the money the Fed financing the borrowing, and then with the government going into partnership with, let's say, the 10,000 leading American entrepreneurs and scientists, creating joint venture companies with these entrepreneurs and scientists, in which the government funds these companies lavishly in exchange for a 60% equity stake in these companies. And the managers, the entrepreneurs and the best scientists in the United States keep a 40% equity stake. And when one of these companies invents a cure for cancer and another invents a cure for Alzheimer's disease and kidney disease and obesity, and diabetes, and all the other diseases, list these things on NASDAQ with trillion-dollar valuations, and the whole thing pays for itself many times over. And we cure all the diseases and radically expand life expectancy and make everyone much better off. This is what we can accomplish. And along the way, we can ensure that China doesn't overtake us militarily, that China doesn't develop artificial intelligence first, that we maintain the lead that we have enjoyed since probably World War I. If we don't radically alter our investment decisions at the government level, then the first American century is going to be the only American century. But if we adopt the possibilities that I've outlined in this book to invest on a multi-trillion-dollar scale, then the first American century will prove to be only the first of many.
So hopefully everybody else got chills there as well, because I actually completely agree with the way that Richard just framed that. Now, part of the challenge is I disagree with Richard on some of the details. But what Richard has very clearly laid out here is exactly what you hear me repeat repeatedly, which is this dynamic of dare to be great, dare to actually solve the problem. Right now, I would change some of the priorities, but I think he's hit on a couple of really critical components. One is this dynamic of who owns this? Well, guess what? You do. As an American citizen, you own 60% of any innovation that is created in this. Now, is that the right proportion? I don't know.
I don't know either.
Right? Correct. And that's the right answer, right? We don't know what the right answer is, but we should be having this discussion.
Quickly.
100% agree with that. And the second thing that Richard is saying.
Luckily we are. Sorry,
we're starting to. We're starting to.
The Chips and Science Act passed, $280 billion investment. That passed Congress, was signed into law by the president. $280 billion, $50 billion to be invested in developing U.S. semiconductor factories in the United States, and all the rest going to investments in new industries and technologies, all the ones I named earlier. This is a big first step in the right direction, showing it's possible.
I totally agree. I totally agree. To me, this was, and just to be very clear to everyone, I'm a voting Republican. It makes me want to vomit in my mouth that I have to say that and caveat it in any way, shape, or form, right? But I agree that this is the first step of saying, hey, we could actually do something different. So I'm very encouraged by that. I also just want to highlight people like, we've got we've got something like a $5 trillion U.S. government budget, and we're talking about $50 billion, right? Like, just stop and think about that for a second. It's tiny. The numbers we're talking about are really small, and that's one of the most powerful things Richard does in his book is he highlights, let's say we spent $10 trillion and none of it paid anything back. Guess what? We're talking about adding 20% to the debt to GDP of the country. Now, I may have particular disagreements around, do we choose to devote it here? Do we choose to focus it in human capital development? Do we choose to focus it in making better opportunities available for the vast majority of American citizens? And do we reinforce the dynamics of this is actually an open source movement within the United States from which all citizens should benefit? Like, those are all questions that we should have. But the fundamental message is the same, which is we're actually terrified to dare to be great. And we have to figure out a different way of doing it. Okay.
Yes,
With
yes.
that, let
So
me.
with this book, what I'm saying is the U.S. should undertake a multi-trillion-dollar investment program over the next 10 years. How much? I don't know. Let's get started and see. If it overheats the economy, then we can slow it down. But just for the purpose of illustration, I use I set out examples for a $10 trillion investment program over 10 years, starting
Yep.
off gradually and then building up. And to have the most pessimistic scenario possible, I assume that every last cent of this $10 trillion is wasted. It doesn't make the GDP bigger, which of course it would. It doesn't bring any tax revenues, which of course it would. It doesn't result in any new technological breakthroughs. So in this worst case scenario, 10 years from now, the US government debt to GDP, which the Congressional Budget Office forecast will be 121% of GDP 10 years from now. Instead of 121%, it would be 151. So that's a big number. But Japan today is 260% government debt to GDP. Japan was at 150% of GDP in 2002, 21 years ago. So in this worst case scenario where every last cent of $10 trillion is invested and produces nothing good whatsoever, the United States level of debt to GDP 10 years from now would be where Japan's was 21 years ago. And if the Fed finances this $10 trillion by creating paper money and nothing good whatsoever comes from it, then 10 years from now, the Fed's total assets as a percent of GDP would be 58% of GDP. Right now, the Bank of Japan's total assets are 4 times that. It's twice that level, 127% of GDP now. And the ECB, they're higher now than we would be 10 years from now. ECB's total assets to GDP are 65%. Japan's are 127% now. Ours, 10 years from now, the Fed would be 58% of GDP. So this shows you we can do this. We can do this very easily. Might not be the hardest part is getting it through Congress, but and no doubt there will be complications and problems, but we can overcome them. Every generation has to find solutions to the challenges that confront it, and our generation is going to have to do the same thing if we are going to survive and prosper. And this is my offer. This is what I'm offering as a solution. I'm happy to listen to other proposals. If they're better, I'll support them.
So, I think that's a great opportunity for us to open it up. I'm going to put up one more chart just to stimulate some of the conversation to come out of this. This is an analysis that I've shared previously that looks at government spending and the return, effectively the net cost of these strategies. And I'm putting this up there just to highlight something really important. And it speaks to the dynamics of Europe. It speaks to the dynamics of Japan. If as a government you choose to spend your money buying effectively political calm by paying off the old people, it's a terrible strategy. Invest in the young, right? Have the courage to share with your population, here's what we have to do. And the answer is spend on the young. It's not spend on the old. It's not increase the amount of healthcare that's available. It's not provide hip replacements to 95-year-olds. It's make sure that young children have adequate nutrition, excellent education, all down the line. Right. So I've posted this into the Twitter Spaces, into the Nest. I'm going to open it up to questions now. Anyone want to put up their hand and ask a question, please join us. We have no interest from anyone. Oh, wait, hold on. Stan Kanarowski. Stan, I am going to add you as a speaker. Let's go.
Hello, Stan.
Stan, you need to unmute yourself. All right, Stan, you're golden. I can't hear you. Oh, Stan, I feel like you had the absolute right idea but you're not showing up. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to add the next speaker, Wheat Extraordinaire. And Stan, if you need to come back down, you can, if you need to drop out and then come back in, I promise, I'll put you right back up. Just request yourself as a speaker. Wheat Extraordinaire, you're
Hey,
up.
thanks for the excellent conversation, Michael, as usual. Just brilliant to hear. I just wanted to make this really quick observation. I've noticed like the conversation in the United States around environmental sustainability is like we're gonna just throw an unlimited, godless amount of money at it. So much so that we're gonna subsidize upper middle class people to buy luxury vehicles, and we're gonna give each one of them like $7,500 uh, just to do that, right? But when I hear that, at the same time, I constantly hear on the radio, like, how food banks are, like, always running out of food, and how, like, fundamentally, if you're poor in America or even in Canada, there's a real risk that kids go hungry, right? It's, like, so incredible for me to think, like, oh, we just have an unlimited amount of money. If you want to go out and buy yourself a luxury electric vehicle, but when it comes to like feeding the most needy of society, we're willing to risk people going hungry. It just blows my mind. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
I'm no. Wheat Extraordinaire, you proved your name. I am 100% with you. I think it is disgusting the way that we behave. It's part of the reason you hear me raising my voice so stridently. And I just want to highlight one other quick component, and Richard may actually disagree with me on this, but when we have this quantity of debt that is held by those who can charitably be described as our enemies, and we choose to hike interest rates, we're giving them more dollars. This is the dumbest possible policy we could ever have. So I just want to emphasize that and keep that in your back pocket and remember that that's what we're actually doing when we hike interest rates on a voluntary basis in a futile attempt to target inflation, which has already retreated exactly for the reasons that I had said it was going to. What we're doing is we're giving extra dollars to the Chinese to fight us. This is insane. Okay, looks like we managed to get Stan back up. Stan, can I add you as a speaker? Thank you very much. I'm going to drop you down just to keep things clean. I appreciate your comment. Stan, you need to unmute yourself. Let's try again.
Yeah, sorry about that. So I want to thank you for having this great room, and both you, Michael, and you, Richard, have made this very educational. And I think I like the framework that you presented. I just wanted to kind of push back slightly on a couple components. One, this idea of the government funding all or new technologies. I think that I really like that idea, but I think it perhaps instead of the government directly funding, I think providing a structure whereby people, or a framework whereby the venture capital or newer forms of funding is enabled, so you're not competing against the marketplace, but instead change the marketplace to get to the goals that you want to use. So that's one kind of structure, but that's a slight twist.
Hey, Stan, can I actually pause for 1 second, just because I'm at least having a little trouble hearing you, but I just want to try to rephrase what you just said. So Stan is correctly identifying that one of the risks of the government engaging in this type of spending is that it behaves effectively as the crowding out phenomenon, right? If the government is in competition with the private sector for provision of resources, it can raise the prices of everything in a sector and make it overall less effective. Is that a fair characterization of what you just said, Stan?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so I completely agree with that. And one of the key risks that you run under that framework is that the public officials that you elect are not sufficiently incentivized by their civic duty. Instead, they're captured by the private sector interest, right? I become the White House czar for handing out technology, and my next step is to work at a venture capital firm, right? Those types of conditions are the components that Jugurtha referred to Rome as a city meant to be bought by a bidder if they can be found, right? We absolutely need to elect the right representatives that are willing to say, I'm doing this for the civic good as compared to my own personal pocketbook. Unfortunately, I think a lot of the dynamics that you just highlighted are part of the reason why we get, ridiculous representatives like Nancy Pelosi or whoever I'm blanking on the Republican, the kid in the wheelchair, which, has now endeared me to everybody else out there. Like these are just terrible people. We shouldn't be doing this. Madison Cawthorn, that's his name. We shouldn't be doing this. We need to put the right people in who exhibit the components of civic virtue that actually allowed the United States to thrive. There's a reason why we should venerate George Washington, because he had the opportunity to become king and he turned it down. Like you can't substitute for that. So like it is a component that is on us. We need to elect the right representatives. I'm sorry, keep going.
Okay. So a second point I wanted to bring up is, so we have a world-class education system with world-class researchers that attract a lot of people to the U.S., both for education and then to stay. So I think there's some components of how we think about who comes to the U.S., how much education you can get in the U.S., and how we then have a immigration policy that keeps the right people in the U.S. And with that, we have a problem that we have a lot of people, not only from China, but from other countries that come here, get an education here, get their PhDs essentially paid for by our research system, and then take the intellectual property that they learn and take it back to their country. So we need to, as a country, think about this, how we handle this. And there definitely are incentives around taking, having people spend time in the U.S. and take the American system abroad. But I think that it's being taken advantage of by certain countries, and not directly, but there's no doubt that there's people that come here, spend time in the U.S., take the technology home, perhaps directly from university, or perhaps working in a Silicon Valley startup and learning some great information and then going to duplicate that. We don't have a thought-out policy on how that works. So I think that smart people can come up with a great policy. I don't have the idea, but Richard and Michael, I encourage you to think about that. I'll pause, and I have one third item I want to bring up.
So,
Stan,
yeah, go ahead, Richard.
I do agree with your second point. We need to find a way to prevent all of this technology being stolen. But I'd like to discuss more your first point about changing the structure of the way the economy is structured to encourage more private sector investment. Now, I think that's a good idea, and I do think that we've already done a great deal of that. If you look at the corporate tax rate, the corporate taxes as a percentage of GDP, they just keep getting lower and lower and lower and lower and lower. So corporations are paying less and less and less in taxes relative to the size of the economy. And that's what they say is the structure they need to invest more. But that's not giving us the sort of investment that's required. And it's not producing the sort of investment on the scale. And it's not, no matter what we do in terms of changing the tax structure, it's not going to give us a multi-trillion-dollar investment program over the next 10 years. Me has a very big plan. It's called Made in China 2025. It's all outlined. It's laid out. The plan is how to become the world's leading manufacturing power by 2049. They're right on track. It's going to take more than just, tax breaks or lifting a couple of regulations here and there to turn this around. We're going to lose. They're going to win. And the only way I can see that us winning is that if we intervene at the government level by financing these investments the way the Chinese government does.
So this is actually one of these areas where I super strongly disagree with Richard. I think the biggest risk that we actually face is that we become China in our attempt to defeat China. I don't see it at all the same way. I actually think that China faces an inherent disadvantage by choosing an autocratic model. You're effectively placing a parasitic burden on anyone who is trying to accomplish objectives where their first objective is don't offend Xi. That's such an extraordinary burden that we've seen throughout history. It just doesn't work. If you can't offend Louis the 15th, if you can't offend George Washington, if you can't offend Abraham Lincoln, if you can't offend Franklin Delano Roosevelt, then you can't actually speak freely and make the choices that are available. I think we have such a critical advantage from that standpoint that I'm not legitimately concerned with one possible exception. This is now a sprint, right? It's a marathon, but we're going for the hill. And if they make it over the hill first, we could actually lose, despite the fact that we're better athletes, despite the fact that we had better training, despite the fact that everything is in our favor. If they make it over that hill, they could win. And so this is very much like the Sputnik type moment. Just like the Sputnik moment, I support what Richard is saying, but I would frame it slightly differently and say what we need to do is create the opportunities so that the resources are enhanced and we ensure people that those resources are going to be valued in the same way that we do with soldiers, right? What we do with soldiers is we
Michael,
take
can you hear me? Sorry,
super
I lost
valuable
audio for a second.
I can hear you. Yes, Richard. So what I was saying is,
Michael?
you know, that my emphasis, yes, can you hear me, Richard? Richard, I'm going to send you a direct message. I think you need to drop out and then come back in. I'll add you right back in. Okay, so hopefully Richard takes my advice, drops out, comes right back in. The point that I was making on this is that my emphasis would be slightly different. I would much prefer us to say, as a government, we will subsidize the creation of scientists rather than we want to throw $1 trillion at science, you know, capital S in quotes. I think the second approach almost guarantees the crowding out dynamic that was being highlighted. I'm sorry, by the other Stan Kanarowski, who, by the way, brilliant comments. If we try to approach it from the standpoint of let's put $1 trillion to those who are already there, we're going to be much less effective than let's subsidize the creation of a legion of new scientists and new individuals without all the nonsense that we've attached to the academic dynamics. Stan, you mentioned you had one more quick question.
Yeah, well, I had one more thought that I'm not clear on, but I know we have this income inequality issue, and
yes.
To me, if you look at the current state of people that are getting wealthy, a lot of that comes from asset appreciation, and primarily from creating a startup. So Bezos, Elon, and many of the people that work for them become wealthy because of the startup stock options or the equity appreciation in the companies that they work on. So I don't attribute all the income inequality coming from classical wealthy families, but more to the structure of how startups create a lot of wealth for the early shareholders. And I think that there's a thought process that perhaps the government should get to share in that, but also everybody in the U.S. Should get some way to share in the appreciation of companies in a different structure than we have right now, where the 401k shares in companies that have already gone public, but not in the early phase, even though a lot of the engineering work does come originally from the NSF or the national or the NIH, at least on the hard sciences. So again, I don't have the answer, but my perception is that we as taxpayers are contributing to a lot of the success, which is contributing to the framework. But the winners, the Elons, well, I guess the people that work for Elon do extremely well, become multi-millionaires or much higher, and it creates income inequality just because they got the lottery ticket on the company they went to. I think there's a more equitable way to share that.
So I notice in your profile you're a 4-time CEO. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I assume each of those have been a failure?
No, 2 of them have been good exits.
Okay, I'm teasing in part to actually raise this point. You're highlighting something that I've hit on my Substack, which is the dynamic of luck, right? The reality is, if you chose to go to work for Pointcast, which I guarantee 95% of the listening audience has no idea what I'm talking about, you had a radically different experience than if you happened to go to work for Google, right? That's luck. That's not your unique skill. The venture capitalists that invested in Google versus Alta Vista, I hate to break it to you, that's luck, not skill. Right now, elements of it are skill. I'm not going to take away that entirely, but it really is a function of, did you happen to pick heads or tails in many situations? And I think you're hitting on a really important point, Stan, which is there has to be a more equitable system of distribution than simply saying, hey, guess what? I managed to get the right flip of the coin. Therefore, I'm a genius and entitled to everything that comes out of it. Right? Like it's a messed up system. It really is truly a messed up system in which we've forgotten the basic components. And this is why I highlight the work of Ole Peters and others. We're a social species. We share in success. We all participate in the success. The idea that it's uniquely tied to an individual attribute is total horseshit. And we need to have the courage to accept that. It's one of the real pains for me associated with the loss of institutions like religion, is that ability to have what they used to refer to as grace, to say, I got lucky, and mean it, not false humility. That's a really hard thing for people to accept in today's world. So Stan, brilliant comments. I really enjoyed it. Do me a favor, send me a DM. I'd like to chat with you a little bit more.
Thank you for the room, Michael.
Okay. Let's see. Neely, I'm going to bring you up in a second, but first I'm going to bring up Adam, who was ahead of you. Adam, you're up as a speaker. Stan, I'm removing you again just to be clean rather than anything else. And let me see if I can find Richard, who unfortunately got booted. Joe, go ahead and, Adam, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay, great. Thanks, Michael. Yeah, I didn't know about this book, but I just ordered it. I was curious. I was looking through some of the slides and listening at the tail end. I had a question for Richard, or I guess you. When we're talking about China and, Japan and the European Union, basically 3 out of the 4 largest economies in the world, they all run current account surpluses, which is essentially they're dumping their excess goods and excess savings onto America, which we have to accommodate issuing bonds, kind of keeping us in a chronic deficit. I was just curious how you see us rebalancing the U.S. economy, or I guess our monetary system, if they continually repress consumption in their economies just to hoard dollars.
It's a great question. There are components of it, and again, I wish Richard was up. Looks like he's trying to make his way back. So I'll answer in the way that I think. And then I just want to be very clear that it's my opinion, not necessarily Richard's. And my opinion is worth exactly what you have paid for it at this point, which is zero. We have an obligation to Japan as a vassal. We are the empire. They are the vassal state. We have an obligation to allow them to provide an income for their population and to protect them from threats. It is no different than the relationship that a colony would have had with the Roman Empire. So we do have an obligation, and unfortunately, it is always going to be unbalanced. How we choose, and that's exactly why, by the way, you just described every economy other than the United States, the three largest economies, they're all vassal states. They're all dependent upon the empire to sit at the center of it. Japan is relatively well behaved, right? So in 1989, they basically made the choice to roll over and stop threatening the United States. China did not do that. And so the unfortunate reality is that we have to discipline China and disengage with China and punish China while we need to reward Japan and Germany, and many other countries that have the similar relationship with the United States. It sucks, but those are just simple realities. In the same way that we can't allow West Virginia to descend into chaos within the United States, even though its population in aggregate requires support from the rest of the United States.
Michael.
So that's my perspective on it. I could be totally, like, Richard is finally back with us, so I'll let you answer that question as well, Richard.
Yes, very sorry. I think I missed the last 5 minutes. I don't know what happened. So I don't know what the last question was.
The question was raised that other than the United States, the next three largest economies in the world are all running major surpluses. How should we think about
that? It's something that is going to persist. It's going to be very difficult to unwind that in the short term. And in the meantime, it's something that we can actually take advantage of, because the countries with the trade surpluses, they accumulate dollars. And once they have the dollars, they have to reinvest them back in US dollar denominated assets, making it easier to finance the government's borrowing at low interest rates. So this dollar standard is really what we're talking about. It creates this situation where the US dollar is the global reserve currency because, first of all, we won the Second World War, and at the end of the war, we had almost all the world's gold. France came next. And so there were we couldn't go back to the gold standard. But in recent decades, it's remained the global reserve currency just because the US current account deficit, the trade deficit, keeps throwing out so many new dollars day after day, month after month, and year after year, throwing out more dollars every year. And other countries accumulate those dollars. So there's just a growing stockpile of dollars around the world. And that's why we have the reserve currency, and that's not going to change anytime soon. China doesn't have a reserve currency because they have a big trade surplus. They don't have a deficit that's throwing out yuan into the global economy. So it's not going to change. And so we might as well take advantage of it.
And I think, Richard, you might agree with what I was just saying, which is, to the extent that those who are participating in that system acknowledge their dynamics as vassal states, even if they don't prostate themselves in that component, that's fine. We're going to have to allow that. But when you have an entity behaving in a manner similar to how China is behaving right now, the unfortunate reality is you can't continue to subsidize.
That's right. And I think that the U.S. is moving in the right direction in terms of what it's doing now, imposing sanctions on preventing China from obtaining advanced semiconductors, for instance.
And by the way, just to be clear, for those without the historical perspective, we did the exact same thing with Japan, right? Richard referred earlier to the Plaza Accord. That was part of that dynamic. The dynamics around the trade tariffs that were introduced on Japan in the late 1980s were an explicit statement of this, right? We've lacked the courage to enforce that with China. I'm hopeful that we do a better job going forward. Okay, I'm going to bring up two more questions. One is, Neely, I promise you're going to follow up as the end. Howard Terry, I am going to add you as a speaker. Adam, I want to thank you for your excellent question. I'm removing you as a speaker, not for any other reason than just to keep things clean up at the top. Howard, unmute yourself. You're welcome to ask a question.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Richard. This has been a great space. I have what might be a little bit of an offbeat question, but under UN treaties, the wealth, the value of the resources in the oceans are supposed to belong to the peoples of the earth. And we've been now looking at monetizing, for example, or financializing the carbon values in large marine mammals, say like whales. It was the first thing proposed. And I'm wondering if there's a place, there have been various systems proposed, like the Global Resource Bank, for monetizing and distributing this wealth. And I'm wondering if there's a place in our credit system for incorporating something like this, or if we would throw things too far out of kilter if we tried to do this in actuality.
Richard, I'll let you hit that one first.
Well, Howard, that is a very interesting question, and it's something I haven't given any thought to and know very little about. So I'm not, I don't know how that would work. And so I'm sorry, I don't think I can give you an intelligent reply to your interesting question.
And I would second that and say, actually, this is exactly the type of conversation that should be happening in the halls of power. I'm hopeful, Howard, that you're able to get people talking about some of these things. My reaction, having had a few moments to think about it, well, Richard avoided the question. I'm teasing, Richard. It is to say that I'm always less concerned with exploitation of resources for the very simple reason that I genuinely believe that human innovation will actually create solutions. And I would just highlight dynamics around aquaculture, et cetera, having addressed many of the concerns that we had a decade ago that we would fully deplete fish stocks, et cetera. We will solve these problems. It becomes a question of, do we create the incentives and do we create the systems that allow humans to solve them?
My question on this is whether this would potentially play a role in that, and I'd be interested in probing further in the side conversations or wherever it's appropriate as we look into what how these resources can be monetized or financialized and distributed. And I tend to agree with you, Michael. Aquaculture is a perfect example of that. Thanks very much, guys.
But before you hop off, Howard, I just want to emphasize you just hit on a really important component, right? This is a resource. This speaks to the overall dynamics of what the incredible opportunity is, right? I mean, oceans have not yet begun to be exploited in the same way that we have exploited land masses. We're just now beginning to learn what we're capable of doing within these regimes. A good friend of mine has a desalinization technology that I look at and I just laugh because I recognize how unbound we actually are in terms of the provision of fresh water should we choose to embrace technology and the solutions associated with it. So it's part of the reason that I struggle with the hysteria that exists. Like I've got plenty of hysteria on topics that seem extremely esoteric to other people, but I have a deep enough knowledge that I'm aware of the challenges that we face. As I look at things like water shortages or shortages of food, et cetera, I just can't embrace them because there's such an extraordinary history of our ability to solve these types of problems that I'm really not that concerned about it. but I think it's a brilliant observation, and providing mechanisms for capital to be invested, providing a clear property right, providing very clear guidelines around how to do and engage properly in that type of activity are all areas that we could contribute significantly. Anyone who's ever interested in that sort of thing, by the way, I cannot recommend strongly enough to read the work of Katerina Pistor. Her work on legal theories, et cetera, is just so robust and so strong, and it's so valid in terms of how legal frameworks actually can truly create value that I just can't emphasize it enough. I'm really hoping that I can get her on to discuss some of her recent work. Okay, Howard, thank you very much. I'm going to jump over to Neely. Give me 1 second here. And Neely is one of my absolute new favorites. I'm going to let you close it out. Richard, you've been extremely generous with your time. It's getting a little bit late, and my second glass of bourbon is going down extraordinarily well. So we're going to wrap it up.
You might need that for this question, Michael. Gentlemen, it was a joy to have book club on Sunday night. But I have to tell you, I continue to have a haunting curiosity, and that is, there is no political will to have a spending bill of $10 trillion. So what will it take to convince 535 members of our money purse to do this?
Well, I have my answer, but I want to hear Richard's first.
Well, so again, the 10 trillion was just a big round number to use as an example. What I'm asking for and pointing as doable is a multi-trillion-dollar investment over a decade. How I think the U.S. government should invest as much as possible, as fast as possible, and if it starts to overheat the economy, they can slow it down and then speed it back up when those bottlenecks causing the inflation are overcome. But what's it going to take? Well, it's going to take a book like The Money Revolution, I think, How to Finance the Next American Century, and people getting behind the book and getting behind this sort of idea and talking about it and going through the logic of it and having a debate about it, and hopefully getting some very well-known people to support the idea. So if anyone listening now knows any such people who could really have an influence on Congress, then please notify them, put them in touch with me. But I will say that actually I have been contacted by a member of Congress. And if things go according to plan, I'm going to be visiting Washington next month to discuss this with him and I hope many of his colleagues. So this is quite a big breakthrough that I haven't mentioned anywhere before now publicly for fear that the thing will fall through. But so I think progress is being made. I've been talking about this sort of now for many years. And in the past, people would all say, well, that's theoretically interesting, but the government is never going to do anything like that. Well, now we have proof that the government has started doing something exactly like that with the Chips and Science Act, and also the Infrastructure Reduction Act apparently is going to send a lot of money toward developing new industries and technologies as well. So I believe, information, tell the people the truth, tell what the options are. Let's have clear analysis of how our economic system works and the opportunities that it creates for us. It's more or less a once in history opportunity. So it's kind of everyone has heard of Joseph Schumpeter and his idea of economic growth being driven by waves of innovation. I think what we're experiencing is truly sort of a Schumpeterian innovation in the form of the combination of fiat money and globalization. Fiat money eliminates all the constraints on credit creation, and globalization eliminates all the constraints on labor and industrial capacity constraints, meaning that this can be done without high rates of inflation. So this is a new Schumpeterian innovation that has been driving, perhaps one of the main drivers of economic growth now for the last 3 decades. It just hasn't been recognized as such. And over time, it will be. And we just need to learn how to make the most of this, because this arrangement may not last forever. In fact, it won't last forever. If we have a big reversal of globalization, then it certainly would become, if not impossible, very much more difficult. And if China invades Taiwan, then things are going to become certainly much more difficult. But as long as this opportunity exists, we need to try to take the advantage of it as quickly as possible and as aggressively as possible.
So I think Richard did a really good job of answering that. I would make it slightly more explicit. I actually think China's role and the globalization dynamic are much less important than Richard does. I think it has much more to do with the dynamics of actually embracing the opportunity. And we're seeing that in everything ranging from additive manufacturing and the technologies that are beginning to emerge there to the artificial general intelligence and AI capabilities of things like a chat GPT. One of the most fascinating pieces I read recently was Stephen Wolfram just put out a piece linking Wolfram Alpha, which is a mathematics program, with chat GPT. This sort of stuff is going to start to accelerate very rapidly. Things that we didn't imagine were possible are going to increasingly become everyday occurrences. That's part of the reason why you hear my tone on this stuff changing. I actually think that we're past the worst part of this if we allow ourselves to be. I don't think that we're allowing ourselves to be right now. I think this is largely a mental barrier more than anything else. But I also completely agree with Richard's articulation of the urgency of this and the ramifications of failing. And so, Neely, it's a great question. If we lack the courage to move forward on this, can we proceed? And I think, unfortunately, the answer is no. And therefore, it is incumbent upon all of us individually and collectively to try to change that path. And that's part of the reason why I'm speaking up so aggressively in this setting. Did that carry? That make sense?
It does. I mean, I keep thinking, of our conversation around, what's missing. I mean, Schumpeter's, innovation is delightful, but I think I'm still in Team McCluskey on virtues and ideas is more unifying.
I totally agree, which is part of the reason why you hear me using the phrase, the courage to act.
Yes.
Right. We're terrified. As a people, we are mouse right now. We are so frightened of ourselves. We're so frightened of making a mistake. So one of the things I loved about Richard's book was highlighting and presenting it from the perspective of, imagine we wasted all of this. Look how small it is relative to everything else. Right. Now, I may disagree with Richard in terms of the individual priorities, and I may disagree with him on some of the aspects of, should we actually say it is not going to be inflationary? Because let's be very candid. If we make mistakes in allocating, if we choose to spend it in ways that turn out to be unproductive, it will be inflationary, right? I think that failure to share that truth with the American public is part of the reason why we're so terrified right now, right? But we absolutely have the potential to do this.
And then,
okay.
Can I just ask one tiny little question?
Yes,
Richard,
yes.
Please, Richard, you clearly have written many books. Was there anything on the cutting floor that is around the corner for us to think about where you're headed next?
Oh, great question.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for the question, Neely. This book took 4 years to write. And the reason it took so long is because it was largely written by the time COVID started. And COVID, as you can imagine, threw up so many problems for the book. Here I am recommending a multi-trillion-dollar investment program to be financed by the Fed, since it had all worked out so well after 2008 with no inflation. And then suddenly, we don't know how many $1 trillion the government's going to have to spend in 2020 and 2021, and how much money the Fed's going to have to print for during those 2 years. So I had to put the book more or less completely on hold all during 2020 until we began to see some clarity, and then rewrite a couple of chapters, write a new chapter, and it was really difficult to do. And so there were some things on the cutting floor. I wrote chapters on monetary policy as it's being carried out by the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, and the PBOC to sort of put this money creation into a global perspective, all the money in the world and who's creating it. But those chapters got cut. Maybe at some point in the future they will be revived. But right now I'm intent on promoting the ideas in this book for the foreseeable future.
Thank you.
Thank you, Neely.
All right. I'm sending quick messages to people who are left. I cannot thank people enough for their willingness to join and to participate. This was absolutely fantastic. Richard, you're a treasure, as is the audience that participated. Thank you so much. I know that everybody says these things, but it means so much to me that people are interested in participating. I encourage you to check out Richard's work. His video podcasts are excellent, and I would consider him well worth the effort. And likewise, you can check out my Substack, which is linked in my profile. I'm putting stuff out on a weekly basis now. Obviously, the work I do is Simplify. I appreciate any attention that we get there. And I just wanted to say thank you one last time. So we're all part of the solution. You guys are amazing. We're all gonna, to steal from the Bitcoin crowd, we are gonna make it. It might be painful, but we will eventually get there. America does the right thing after it exhausts all other alternatives. So thank you again. And Richard, anything you want to end with?
Just, Michael, thank you so much for having me on today. And it's been a real joy getting to know you over the last couple of weeks. So let's stay in touch.
I'm looking forward to it. Okay, we're going to close it up. Thank you so much, everyone. And if you have questions that you'd like to have answered, you can submit them on Substack. You can send them to me on DM. Richard has made himself extraordinarily available, and we'll continue to follow this path. I haven't decided what my next book that we're going to do is. I would love feedback on Substack or via DM or tweets or however you want to share it. I'm leaning towards Jacob Soul's Free Market. It's a book with a tremendous amount of controversy around it. I would argue that it has been broadly misinterpreted by a literalist interpretation, and I think many of the ideas are worth sharing. But as I said, I'm open to other ideas in terms of discussion. So with that said, we're going to wrap it up. This has been 2 hours and 20 minutes. You guys have been extraordinarily generous with your time. Richard, you have been fantastic. And I do look forward to continuing to have the conversations. And thank you for everyone who participated. We're going to end there.